In a world that often discards talent as it ages, Lee Grant has rewritten the rulebook. Imagine earning your first Oscar nomination in 1951, only to be erased from Hollywood 2 days later. Picture the FBI tapping your phone, shadowing your every move, and watching your bank account plummet from 75,000 to a mere 4,000. Envision a marriage fracturing under the weight of suspicion, a career vanishing overnight, and survival demanding the use of fake names just to teach a craft you love. Now fast forward nearly 7 decades. At 99 years old, Lee Grant is still directing films, and her journey, from meteoric rise to harsh exile and triumphant return, will absolutely blow your mind. Let's begin at the apex of triumph, the 24-year-old actress standing beside Hollywood royalty, her name called out for an Academy Award nomination. It was 1951, and Lee Grant, then still Leova Haskell Rosenthal, had delivered a searing performance in Detective Story that earned her a golden ticket to the Oscars. Critics were stunned, audiences were captivated. Her path forward seemed unstoppable. 2 days later, her world imploded. In a pamphlet called Red Channels, she was branded a communist sympathizer. Welcome to the McCarthy era, where fear became currency, and a single accusation could wipe out a career in an instant. Lee's story starts even before the glare of studio lights. Born on October 31, 1925, in Manhattan to Russian, Jewish immigrants who fled Odessa's violence, her childhood bore the weight of survival and ambition. Her mother, Witty, pushed her into ballet, opera, and acting classes with a determination that bordered on obsession. By age 4, Lee was performing at the Metropolitan Opera. By 11, she danced with the American Ballet Theater. And yet, behind each curtain call lay fierce expectations and a fear of failure, driven by parents who had known true desperation. By the time she changed her name to Lee Grant at 17, she had endured poverty, family arguments over culture and religion, and even her mother's tragic suicide attempt. She carried those scars onto every stage, forging an inner steel that no studio blacklist could break. In 1948, Broadway critics were astounded when the teenager, virtually unknown, claimed the spotlight in Joy to the World. She demanded challenging roles, learned method acting from the best, and approached every character with an unflinching authenticity that would become her hallmark. Then came the fateful union with screenwriter Arnold Manoff. Initially, it felt like a partnership of creative minds. Yet Arnold's leftist associations and Lee's own impassioned eulogy for a friend's government-related death thrust her onto the radar of the House Un-American Activities Committee. She refused to betray her husband or testify against friends, choosing principle over self-preservation. The consequence: an industry-wide shutdown, no more film roles, no television gigs, and contracts torn up without warning. Overnight, Lee Grant went from rising star to untouchable. The abyss that followed could have consumed her. Deprived of steady income, Lee pawned her jewelry to feed herself and her daughter, taught acting classes under false names, and performed in clandestine theater productions for a fraction of her former salary. She lived formulaic days, always watching her back, never knowing if the next knock on her door would be a casting director or an FBI agent. Under constant surveillance, she endured break-ins, phone taps, and the paralysis of being ostracized by an industry that once cheered her every step. Yet in the midst of darkness, Lee discovered her true strength. While teaching a ragtag group of students in a cramped Manhattan apartment, She realized the power in hidden spaces. She nurtured raw talent behind closed doors and chose truth over silence. Every lesson she gave, every performance she delivered under a pseudonym, was a rebellion against an unjust system. Her reputation among insiders grew, paradoxically fueled by the very suppression that sought to silence her. By examining these early chapters, we see a woman who combined fierce talent with unshakable integrity. Lee Grant's refusal to cooperate with HUA did more than cost her a career. It revealed a moral courage that would define every later success. It set the stage for a comeback, not merely as an actress, but as a storyteller unafraid to confront cultural taboos, institutional injustices, and the human cost of fear. This narrative crackles with tension, the dazzling promise of youth colliding with the harsh machinery of political paranoia. It forces us to ask, what would you sacrifice for your principles? How far would you go to protect the truth? And could you survive when the world turns its back? Lee Grant answered all these questions, not just with her art, but with the indomitable will she carried into her 9th decade. During her 12th-year exile from film and television, Lee Grant lived in a constant state of limbo. One morning, she would descend the narrow stairwell of her Bronx apartment, secondhand coat buttoned tight, and walk past the pawnbroker's window, where her wedding ring dangled beside other discarded treasures. By afternoon, she'd slip into a hidden studio space in Manhattan, teaching a handful of aspiring actors who paid her in cash attention and the promise of finding their own voices. Each lesson was a delicate dance of revelation and concealment. She forged raw talent into disciplined craft, while guarding her true identity with layers of pseudonyms and whispered warnings. A sign on her classroom door might read, "Acting Masterclass," but only a select few understood whose hands guided them. Outside, the city roared on, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in those cramped quarters. While Lee nurtured young artists behind closed doors, she faced unrelenting scrutiny. Surveillance cameras weren't yet everywhere, but federal agents had perfected subtler forms of espionage, suspicious neighbors, chance encounters that felt staged, and envelopes slipped under doors containing veiled threats. She discovered that even teaching acting could be dangerous. A prominent journalist once knocked on her door, requesting an interview on theater trends, only to vanish the moment Lee mentioned a certain Hollywood blacklist. Every phone call might be tapped, every step could bring her face to face with an unseen observer. Still, she refused to bow to fear. She believed that artistry was inseparable from truth, and that silence, more than any public testimony, could cement injustice in place. As her savings dwindled, Lee sold the clothes she'd worn to studio screenings and borrowed money from close friends who lived far from the spotlight. She watched what remained of her Hollywood earnings flow through bank statements like a once mighty river reduced to a trickle. Doctors warned her about stress-induced memory lapses. A former classmate noticed her struggle to recall names and dates that once came easily. Instead of retreating, Lee channeled that trauma into empathy. She shared her story in private circles, advising her students on not just technique, but on survival strategies in a world that could erase you overnight. Each word she spoke to budding actors was drenched in the authenticity of someone who had truly known life's extremes, from standing ovations to total oblivion. Meanwhile, the broader cultural tide began to shift. The blind patriotism that fueled McCarthyism waned as intelligent voices in journalism and academia exposed the excesses of the Red Scare. Documentaries on civil liberties found eager audiences. College campuses rang with debates on ethics and governance. Yet for Lee Grant, the slow unraveling of institutional paranoia didn't mean instant redemption. Hollywood often lags behind society's highest ideals, and until the studios recognized their own complicity in blacklisting, old wounds would remain raw. She learned to measure progress in inches rather than miles, celebrating small victories like a theater production that dared to cast a formerly banned actress or a magazine profile that mentioned her acting school under her real name for the first time. Her personal life, too, shifted in unexpected ways. Lee and Arnold Manoff's marriage, forged in mutual respect for creativity, fractured under the sustained pressure. Money rarely eased tension, silence cut deeper. When she discovered his affairs, rumors of his continuing party ties, and the distances that grown fear had inserted between them, she realized that loyalty had its limits. By 1964, their divorce was finalized, and Lee emerged determined to rebuild not only her career but her sense of self. The end of her marriage, painful as it was, freed her from the last tether to the past that Hollywood had used against her. She began to see the Blacklist as both a curse and a crucible. Whatever emerged on the other side would be stronger and more complex. 1964 brought the first real crack in the Blacklist armor. Through discreet connections, a legal technicality allowed Lee to clear her name. It wasn't triumphant fanfare. It was the lifting of a heavy cloak when no one was watching. She returned to New York stages under her own name and slipped back into television with a role in Peyton Place. When she walked onto that set, her posture carried both hope and the hard, won stature of someone who'd survived every indignity. Night after night, she poured herself into Stella Cherniak's trials, tapping into the well of fear and resilience that had defined her own existence. The result was electric. Emmy recognition followed almost immediately, and suddenly Hollywood began to listen again. The difference this time wasn't about youthful promise. It was deeper. Lee Grant's comeback resonated because she embodied a living history of injustice and redemption. Producers saw beyond box office numbers. Directors felt the authenticity she brought to each frame. Her performances now hinted at hidden scars, giving her characters a vulnerability that teetered on the edge of revelation. She wasn't just acting grief, she was channeling decades of personal turmoil into art. The critics praised her ability to unearth unexpected emotional layers in seemingly straightforward roles. And she relished this renewed respect, knowing that every accolade carried the weight of years spent in forced silence. Suddenly, film roles reappeared, not as fleeting cameos, but as substantial parts that allowed her to shine. And in the heat of the night, her flinty portrayal of Mrs. Colbert crackled with resentment and raw emotion. Fueled by an off-camera grief, she transformed into a career-defining moment. Valley of the Dolls, though reviled by critics, became a cult classic in large part because her scene-stealing performance tapped into the underbelly of Hollywood's own ambition. Awards followed another Oscar nomination here, a triumph in Cannes there. Each milestone felt doubly sweet, a confirmation that her talent had never dimmed, only been deferred. Lee's exile and revival offer a powerful contrast. A young actress silenced by fear made her comeback not by erasing the past, but by owning it. She had transformed her years of deprivation into fuel for performance, her broken memory into a wellspring of authenticity, and her moral stand into a badge of honor. As we reflect on this period, we see the arc of a woman who refused to be a footnote in her own life story. She discovered that resilience isn't merely weathering the storm, but learning to conduct thunder into something electrifying. And in Lee Grant's case, that electricity still crackles, nearly half a century after her forced fall, reminding us that true artistry can survive even the darkest of bans. In 1977, at an age when Hollywood often bypassed older actresses for novelty fresh faces, Lee Grant made a seismic shift. She stepped behind the camera. After decades of mastering character arcs as a performer, she turned her storytelling prowess toward directing, and immediately raised more than $1 million for her first feature, Tell Me a Riddle. What made this project historic wasn't merely its quietly emotional narrative of an aging Jewish couple. It was the fact that Lee assembled the first all-female creative team in American cinema history. Writer, producer, cinematographer, editor. Every key role was filled by women. They shot on location in New York, navigating union rules with the same resourcefulness Lee had cultivated while blacklisted. The result was a triumph at Filmways Pictures, a surprise screening at Cannes, and awards for Best Picture and Best Actor at Edinburgh. That underdog triumph established Lee Grant not just as an actress turned director, but as a barrier breaker who could mobilize resources, talent, and vision against industry odds. Her next directorial step was nothing short of fearless. In 1983, Lee directed When Women Kill for HBO, a documentary that followed real female inmates serving time for murder. She gained unprecedented access to prison cells, allowed to film intimate interviews where women described histories of abuse, poverty, and cultural neglect that culminated in violence. Out of 21st 100 death row inmates, only 12 are women, ran a stark on-screen title, signaling the film's statistical backbone. Lee let her subjects speak without filter, intercutting their testimonies with archival footage of institutional neglect. Critics lauded the film for its raw honesty. Activists screened it in law schools and women's shelters. This project wasn't about sensationalism. It was about humanization, a theme Lee would revisit throughout her directorial career. In 1985, she tackled transgender issues in What Sex Am I?, another pioneering HBO documentary. During the Reagan era, when the topic was dismissed at best and vilified at worst, Lee crisscrossed America, Texas, California, New York, filming transgender individuals who shared their struggles with identity, discrimination, and family rejection. She captured the quiet moments, someone ordering hormones in secret, another practicing a chosen name in front of a mirror, and the public ones. Family dinners erupting in conflict, co-workers whispering behind backs. Reviews hailed the film as brutally candid and a documentary that belongs in the 21st century, yet it was released in 1985. Much like her own life, Lee's work unveiled the marginalized with empathy and unflinching gaze. Anchored by data points about hate crimes and medical access, turning abstract statistics into living souls. Lee's documentarian momentum peaked in 1986 with Down and Out in America, a scathing look at poverty under Reaganomics. She juxtaposed empty factory floors in Minnesota, where 300 farms were foreclosed each week, with families living in mobile homes as foreclosure signs sprouted on their lawns. She chronicled factory workers laid off in 1970s, Midwestern towns, unions powerless against global shifts. The death threats followed screenings in politically conservative districts. Yet HBO embraced the risk, and the Academy agreed. Down and Out in America tied for Best Documentary Feature. It was HBO's first Oscar win, and Lee became the only person to win as both actor and documentary director. In one stroke, the same individual who'd been silenced by McCarthyism now used her voice to spotlight systemic injustice, and won the industry's highest honor for doing so. Transitioning between genres with ease, Lee turned to narrative films that tackled taboo subjects. In 1986, she directed Nobody's Child, based on the true story of Marie Balter, a woman institutionalized for 20 years. The film traced Marie's life through children's home footage, psychiatric records, and interviews with mental health professionals. Marlo Thomas led the cast, earning an Emmy, while Lee's direction was honored with the Directors Guild of America Award. The first woman ever to win in that category. Critics noted how Lee's portrayal of institutional brutality wasn't preachy. Instead, it layered empathy onto the stark reality of mental health neglect. She carved her niche as a filmmaker who wielded compassion alongside incisive critique. By 1989, Lee Grant's directorial portfolio read like a catalog of social conscience. Battered, her documentary on domestic violence, opened windows into shelters where survivors recounted abuse, sometimes alongside perpetrators who admitted guilt yet blamed systemic failure. The film aired on PBS and became a training tool for law enforcement and social workers. Estimates suggest over 10 million viewers watched the initial broadcast, sparking legislative hearings and influencing state-level policy on domestic violence prevention. One police chief admitted, "We had no idea what we were missing until Lee showed us." Lee's ability to translate raw human experiences into compelling narratives made her work both artful and actionable. Amid this creative triumph, Lee never lost sight of her roots as a performer. In 1988, she directed the meta-commentary Airport 77, starring veteran actors in roles reflecting Hollywood's age bias, rich matrons dismissed as relics. Here, she used satire to underscore a grim reality. Actresses over 50 saw roles plummet by 78% compared to male counterparts. Though some critics dismissed it as lightweight, the film's moments of pointed humor and biting social critique revealed Lee's trademark juxtaposition. She could make audiences laugh and think in equal measure. Throughout the 90s, Lee balanced fiction and non-fiction with ease. She returned to acting in supporting roles that underscored her directorial lessons. Characters grappling with institutional failures, family betrayals, and moral reckonings. Then she segued back to directing, helming documentaries on urban poverty, veterans' mental health, and LGBTQ rights, each project demonstrating that no subject was too divisive if approached with respect and rigor. By age 90, Lee Grant had accumulated 2 Oscars, 2 Emmys, a DGA award, and dozens of festival prizes. Yet in interviews, she remained reluctant to dwell on accolades. "Awards are nice," she once said, "but they aren't why we tell stories. We tell them because someone needs to know they're not alone." This philosophy underscored every frame of her work, connecting her personal saga of blacklisting, resilience, and reinvention to audiences hungry for narratives that reflected life's complexities. At 99, Lee Grant's latest project, an oral history of immigrant artists suppressed by political witch hunts, remains in production, fueled by her still burning desire to unearth truth from silence. Nearly a century of memory, filled with triumphs and scars, does not dull Lee Grant's purpose, it sharpens it. At 99, her mind remains a kaleidoscope of images, calls from the Academy. The hush of a packed opera house at age 4, the hush after a jury of her peers returned to a suspicion that cost her everything, and the roar of applause as her directorial debut premiered at Cannes. Each moment stands in relief against the next, illuminating the spaces between danger and courage, loss and rebirth. When asked how she stays driven, Lee pauses, then smiles. "I'm fueled by the stories yet untold." That simple admission reveals a steely curiosity that no blacklist, no political witch hunt, and no industry bias could ever extinguish. Today, Lee's voice even resonates through projects still in motion. Her upcoming documentary on immigrant artists persecuted for their beliefs promises to be another landmark work, meticulously produced with the same insistence on authenticity she displayed in Down and Out in America. Late nights find her poring over archival files in the Los Angeles County Records Center, annotating telegrams sent to her FBI file, examining studio memos that once barred her from sound stages. During breaks, she FaceTimes former students, now acclaimed actors and directors, reminding them that every credit begins with a single courageous choice. She rejects the notion that age limits vision. For Lee, 99 is not retirement, it's an invitation to deeper exploration. Still, her daily routine is remarkably grounded. Mornings often begin with a stroll through Central Park, paper in hand, where she scribbles questions for upcoming interviews. She insists on speaking with a recorder on, explaining that in every conversation lies the seed of a new narrative. Afternoons are reserved for writing her memoirs, a continuation of her 2014 "I Said Yes to Everything." Drafts are scattered across her kitchen table alongside color-coded post. It's that map theme's resilience, redemption, reinvention. The evenings find her in a small screening room at Turner Classic Movies, assisting with the centennial tribute to her life set for October 31, 2025. Clips of her youthful Broadway performances flicker on the wall, juxtaposed with footage of her directing crew members half her age. The contrast is not jarring, it is evidence of a life unbroken, a career unbowed by time. Her legacy plays out far beyond her personal achievements. Women running studios, previously denied leadership roles, now cite Lee as their inspiration. Directors who once saw only token female voices in writers' rooms have restructured teams to include more women behind the camera. Teachers in acting schools from coast to coast reference Lee's underground sessions as a model for nurturing authenticity under pressure. In film studies seminars, her career arc has become a case study on how moral conviction can steer both art and activism, even after a century. Her example ripples through the industry. Proof that one person's refusal to surrender can redirect cultural currents. For emerging artists who grew up on streaming platforms rather than stage wings, Lee offers a strikingly countercultural lesson. Vulnerability is a weapon. Allow your truth to shape your performance, she advises, voice steady. Do not pretend to be fearless. Bring your fears into the light. Students marvel at how someone who has faced federal surveillance and marital betrayal still urges beginners to lay bare their wounds on stage and screen. Yet for Lee, Openness was never a reckless act. It was an act of resistance against a world that demanded conformity. Every tear, every tremble, every triumphant laugh became a statement. I defined my story, not the powerful few who once tried to silence me.